Hello and welcome to the first video in the OneNote Developer Videos series. This is Hilton Giesno, and as we go through the series, you'll learn how to develop against all the operations that the OneNote API will support and how to do so across multiple developer environments and platforms. Before we do, this first introductory video will get you a little bit up to speed on the OneNote client itself, what OneNote itself can do, and also we'll look at some developer resources to get you up and running quickly. So to start off here, we are going to work in the OneNote environment. Now, OneNote was originally part of the Microsoft Office suite way back in 2003, but since then it's gone beyond its desktop borders, and you can get OneNote today on iOS platform, on Android, on Mac, and of course on the Windows platforms as well, Windows Phone, Windows RT, and the Windows Desktop here. We'll also see it available with quite a high fidelity in the browser-based client later on too. So I'm going to work here in the desktop client because that's the easiest to demo in for this video. And unlike a word processor, you'll see when I want to capture new notes, I can go ahead and capture them anywhere in the body of the page here. I can do, of course, basic formatting like bolding and italicizing text, for instance. I can capture another note here wherever I like. I can move the notes around or just go ahead and delete an individual one, for instance. You can see a link and a picture embedded in this OneNote page. I can also go ahead and let's say drag an image in quite easily, and I can even embed things like an actual Word document that will get synced across devices too. Obviously other simple text formatting like bulleting and numbering items and so on is available too. But one of my favorite features is the ability to go ahead and tag content. Like I can tag these as starred items or one of these as a particular question. Or let's say in a meeting I want to go ahead and mark that these items are to do and maybe one or two of them are now complete as well. If I want to bring in some external content, like let's say some text from a blog that I happen to be reading and I want to capture some of the notes out of, I can go ahead and paste that in. When I do, notice right at the bottom there that we get a link to the original article, so it's identified it's come from a web page and pasted us in the original link. And also look at the fidelity of what comes through, so it's remembered that it's a bulleted list that I've pulled it out of, and it keeps the full hyperlinks, for example, and even brings through the image that I copied out of the text too. While we've been working with this note, notice that little sync icon that's been appearing there. The notebook has actually been syncing up into the cloud and down onto all of my devices while we've been working. Within the context of OneNote, notes are stored within these notebooks, as you can see here on the left. So kind of think of notebooks as files on a traditional filing system. And then within the individual notebooks, we have different kind of sections here as well. So to-do, financial, and so on. The quick notes section is quite important. This is a nominated section within one specific notebook where all of your unfiled notes will go. So in the context of the API, any notes you create by default will go into the user's quick notes section into whichever notebook they've defined to store that. Notice also that notebooks can be stored in the cloud. So in this example, the personal and work notebooks that I have here are stored directly into my OneDrive account, but I can also store notebooks, for example, like the sales team notebook, up into a SharePoint account or SharePoint Online in this case too. And finally, down the right-hand side, you can see the actual individual pages that are available in the current section, which is the quick notes section. I can also go and do things like, for example, search within the current document. So let's say, for example, I'll search for the word one inside of this document. You can see the word appearing a few times, but OneNote will even do text recognition within an image. So we can see within the Xbox One image on the left there, it's actually gone and recognized that text. Recall that it's all been syncing. So if I head over to the browser here and I go ahead and open up that same notebook in the browser, it's been transparently syncing here, and I get quite a full fidelity experience into the browser as well. So that's the same page that we were working on, and I can, for example, go ahead and interact with some of the content, detick one of the checkboxes, and so on. So that's a quick overview of the OneNote tool. You can see quite a full ribbon there. There's a whole bunch of other features that are available across all of the devices and across all of the different versions of OneNote, and lots of things that you can do to get up and running and get going and be productive with the tool. If you want to go ahead and get started with the tool itself, you can head over here to www.onenote.com, where you can, for example, get links to all of the different versions of OneNote that you can download across the different clients. So you'll see down at the bottom there all of the versions that are available. And once you've got the OneNote client installed on all your devices, you'll want to head over to the dev.onenote.com site, where you can go ahead and get started to learn about development on the OneNote platform. The dev.onenote.com site contains a lot of information and links to get you started across a number of different locations. So, for instance, under the documentation section here, you'll see links to a getting started guide, which you'll also see the purple button on the front there as well. And that'll open up some documentation. You'll see I'll open it in a new tab, things like the how-tos as well. But notice also links to the API console, to samples. Under the community section here, notice things like StackOverflow, blog, and Twitter. And we'll look at these resources as we go through the video. So into the MSDN documentation, you can see the getting started guide here. It gives you some great starting points to how to get started working with the OneNote API across a couple of key development platforms here. And then the how-to guide here as well, which is the other link that we opened as well, gets you started with a whole series of different scenarios of how you can work with the API to do different kinds of things. The next link that was available off the dev.onenote.com site's top menu was a link here to Apigee, which is a website that allows you to very easily work with a REST-based API. Microsoft have worked with Apigee to create a portal where you can easily try out the OneNote API directly from within a browser. The OneNote API is essentially just a REST-based API that you can make standard HTTP REST calls to. So the API Console lets you test out the requests and responses and actually see the impact without having to fire up an entire development client. So for instance, we have right now only one method available at this point on the OneNote API, the create page method in the API console. So I can go ahead and see what's involved in calling that, the headers and body and so on. The OneNote API makes use of OAuth for authentication. So I'm going to go ahead and sign in here. You'll see it gives me the option to sign in with OneNote. And this loads a portal here where I can go ahead and sign in with my Microsoft account. So I'm just going to sign in and pause the video for a moment while I do that. Okay, I've logged in, and once the page refreshes, I'll have the ability to go ahead and make the post. So I'll go ahead and select the authentication that we've just provided, capture the user token, load up the operation that I want to fire off here, the create page operation. You can see some of the details of the header. So the calls, for example, to the OneNote API accept multi-part data, so I can go ahead and send multiple payloads, like let's say a body and embedded images, for instance. The body itself, though, is essentially just HTML. It's a subset of standard HTML. So not all the tags are supported, but you'll see a lot of standard HTML tags like headings, body, the head tag, the title tag, for example, a paragraph, italics, and so on. All of that kind of standard formatting will work too. Notice that the date needs to be in a very specific ISO format, though, and we'll talk about this in more detail as we get into other videos in this series. So I'm going to go ahead and just hit the send button here and actually fire off the operation. And you'll see that the operation is returned successfully. We've got a HTTP 201 success message here. So being that we sent a create operation, we're getting a successful created response. And if we look down in the payload here, you'll see that the return is a collection of links with two items in it. The one is a client URL, one with a OneNote protocol that will go ahead, for example, on the desktop and fire up the full OneNote client, taking us to the newly created page, and then a web URL that will go ahead and launch the OneNote page in the browser in the web-based version we saw before. If I head back to the desktop client and just force a sync to make it come down quickly, you'll see the new page appearing that we just created from the console appearing directly into my OneNote client here, with, again, all of the fidelity, all of the formatting, the embedded images, and so on. If you want to find out more about what's coming in the OneNote API, you can head over to the OneNote API Team Developer blog, and you can see the content there is pretty fresh. They're posting items on a continual basis. But if you want to get a quick version of that, you can head over to their Twitter account as well, where you'll find out what they're working on and what's upcoming in the OneNote API as well, together with links to partners and other kinds of news that the OneNote team is sending out. All of the links up until this point are available off of the dev.onenote.com site, but there's another useful site as well to take note of, which is the OneNote Developer Team User Voice site, where you can go ahead and actually submit new ideas and vote on other ideas that other people have submitted to go ahead and communicate with the team on the priorities of what they need to work on next on the OneNote API. And the last web resource we're going to look at here is the StackOverflow site, where you'll see they've got a dedicated area just to OneNote related questions, where developers using the APIs can go ahead and ask questions, and the OneNote API team even jump on there to help answer them. To round out this video, we're going to look at some actual code. We're going to be using a C# example here and a Windows Store example, but if you are using another platform, let's say iOS or Android, you can of course look at samples on the GitHub account or on the MSDN documentation. But just to understand some key principles, let's look at some C# code here. So the process of creating a message, and you'll see these also fleshed out in more detail in other videos in the series, but let's have a quick look. You'll see that we fire up an HTTP client, attach certain headers to authenticate and specify the payload type, for example. We go ahead and actually capture data as HTML, and then we go ahead and attach that HTML as the body to a specific message and go ahead and send that message to the server. And the last thing we're going to look at in this video is that if you do want to embed content into the notebook, for example, if you want to attach an image and embed that as part of the upload, or as we saw earlier, embed a Word document into a OneNote notebook, then what you'd be doing is creating a multi-part HTTP request because it's a REST service, but it's one that contains multiple payloads. So in this case, it contains an HTML payload, and it also contains an image payload that we will refer to in the actual HTML body to go ahead and, in this case, embed the image. I hope you've enjoyed this video and seen a little bit about OneNote and what the client does and how to get started learning about how to use the API and where to get some good resources to get started. Look out for all the future videos in this series as we learn across all of the platforms how to make use of all the fantastic features available on the API and that are continuing to be developed. Thanks for watching. Hello and welcome to another video in the OneNote Developer Series. This is Hilton Giesno, and in this video we're going to look at how to get a client ID to call the OneNote API from certain kinds of applications. The OneNote API is a REST service and it makes use of OAuth for the authentication. And therefore we need a client ID so that the services can uniquely identify our application. Now there are two kinds of client IDs. Those for native applications, like a Windows Phone, iOS or Android application, and those kind of applications that are web-based. For example, if you're building an application in ASP.NET, PHP or something like that to call the live services. If you're creating a Windows Store application, you don't need to explicitly create a client ID like we're going to do in this video. You can simply use the tooling that's embedded directly into the Visual Studio, and you can head over to the Windows Store example in this series to go ahead and see how to do that. In a later video, we'll focus on how to get one for a web application. In this video, we're going to focus specifically on getting a client ID for native applications. So to do so, we're going to go ahead here into the Microsoft Account Developer Center, and specifically we're going to go into the applications list and create a new application. So you can see the URL up at the top there, account.live.com/developers/applications. You can also see I have two applications that I've already created here for demo purposes. So we're going to go ahead and create a new application. So up at the top here is the Create Application link. The first step is to give our application a nice friendly name. Now this is the name that's going to appear to the user when they try and call the OneNote services from within your application. So you want to give it a nice friendly descriptive name here. I'm going to do something a little bit nonsensical as my name, but just to make sure that it's unique for demo purposes here. Next, you can choose a default language, and finally, once you've been sure to read the terms of use and the privacy and cookies documentation there as well, you can go ahead and hit the I accept button. At this point, your application has been created, and we can go ahead and set a few additional settings. Like, for example, we can go ahead and capture an application logo so that when the permission screen comes up on the device, this application logo will display together with your application name. You can also capture things like a terms of service URL and a privacy URL if you want the users to be able to click through and see more about your application's terms of service and privacy policy, for example. And then let's go ahead and save our changes. You can see down the left-hand side there are 4 different areas where we can go ahead and configure aspects of our application. So first here we've got the basic information. This is the one that we've just finished. You can see at the top there the changes were saved successfully. Next we can see the API settings, where we can go ahead and set additional settings for our application registration here. So for instance, if we're building a mobile client, we can go ahead and specify that yes, we do want to build a mobile client to make sure that certain of the OAuth 2 authentication settings are set. We can also restrict the JOT tokens here if we want to, for instance, and do things like set the root domain and the redirect URLs if we're building a web-based application to speak to the OneNote API. In this case, we're building a client ID to make use of in a native application, so we're going to ignore those settings for now. The next area here is the app settings. We'll come back to this in just a moment because this is where we get the client ID from. But just going down the list here, we also have a localization setting where we can, for instance, specify the name of our application in multiple languages to localize it. Coming back here to the app settings section, you'll see here the client ID, and this is the one that we're going to make use of in the other videos in this series to go ahead and identify our application. Notice also the client secret. This is a key that you do need to keep secret, so don't embed this into the code of your application. If I head back to the main menu here, under the My Applications list, you'll see the new application that we created. You can see the client ID appearing there if you needed quicker access to it. And you can also go ahead and see things like the logo appearing that we uploaded earlier. Now this video doesn't cover the actual steps of writing an application, so we're not going to look at an IDE for instance, or look at the process of using that client ID. That will come up in later videos. But just to round us off here is a screenshot of making use of this client ID that we just created inside of an Android application, and how the name and the logo and so on appear. Thanks for watching. Hello and welcome to this video. This is Hilton Giesno, and in this video we're going to find out how to build a Windows Phone application to call the OneNote API. So we're going to start off here in Visual Studio, and we're going to go ahead and create a new Windows Phone project. So let's give it a more relevant name here, and go ahead and create the new project. Now there are a few libraries we want to bring in, so we're going to go ahead and use NuGet to do those. You could of course use the graphical user interface, but I'm going to use the console here. The first set of libraries we're going to bring in is the Windows Live SDK, which will help us do things like authenticate against the user's Microsoft account to go ahead and call the OneNote API. Next I'm going to bring in a JSON parsing library because the result that comes back is a JSON payload. And finally, I'm going to go and bring in the Microsoft HTTP client library that will enable me to do the actual REST call to the OneNote REST service. You'll see it's got a few dependencies itself, so let's go ahead and bring all of those in. And once that's done, let's switch over here to the actual designer for the main page in our application and go ahead and start designing some of the user interface for our application. The first thing we want to do is to bring in the new namespace that we want to make use of for the Windows Live controls that ship as part of the SDK on the phone. And specifically, we're going to make use of the out-of-box sign-in button that will handle all of the heavy lifting to go ahead and do a sign-in operation. Next, let's go down into the actual main controls area and go ahead and add the controls that we want. So I'm just going to use a stack panel here. I'm not going to spend too much time on a very pretty user interface just for demo purposes here. Let's go ahead and bring in that new sign-in button that we defined the namespace for. I'm going to give it a name so that we can refer to it in our code behind. And I'm going to go ahead here and specify scopes. Now scopes are effectively the permissions that you're requesting from the Windows Live services. So for example, we're requesting Windows Live to go ahead and allow us to do a sign-in. We're also going to request offline access so that the application doesn't need to continually prompt the user for sign-in, and it can store the credentials for a temporary basis. And then finally, specific to the OneNote operations, we're going to go ahead and request the create permission against the OneNote API. Next up, we can specify some branding on our button. So being that the live services could be used for a few things, we're going to go ahead and make use of the SkyDrive branding here, which will give us a nice little cloud logo on the button. Of course, we know today that this is OneDrive, but the API hasn't yet been updated, so just look out for that change depending on when you happen to be writing the app and when the API gets updated. Next up, we're going to go ahead and specify the actual client ID for our application to authenticate against the services. To get this client ID, the actual steps involved you can see in one of the other videos in this series, how to get a client ID for a native application. I'm just going to go ahead and copy it here and refer you to that video for the steps involved. But effectively, this is the key that the live services use to uniquely identify our application in the store. And finally, a little bit of event handling code that we'll write in a few moments to go ahead and handle the actual sign-in process once the user's completed the sign-in. Next, we'll add a button here for the user to be able to go and create the actual page into the OneNote API, into the OneNote Quick Notes section. We'll give it a name on the button here, go ahead and do an event handler there as well. Next, we're going to put a hyperlink button, and this will enable the user, once they've created a page, to go ahead and actually open that page up in the browser, or for example in the OneNote client on the Windows Phone device. Recall that the OneNote client actually ships out of box with the Windows Phone, so the user can immediately go ahead and actually open up the OneNote client once the page is created. And finally, we're going to add a text block here to go ahead and just write out the results of our call. We'll be writing raw results out just for demo purposes, because it's a developer training video. You wouldn't, of course, write out raw HTTP response typically to the user, but we'll do that so that we can see it in the course of this video. Switching here to the code behind, we're going to go ahead and set some of the initial variables that we want to make use of later on in the video. So we're going to set a string to actually store the access token once the sign-in is complete. We'll store another variable here to contain the URL to the new page that hopefully gets created later. And finally, we'll create a constant here to store the endpoint for the actual OneNote API that we want to ultimately call. One tip, I don't like to ever type these kinds of URLs out by hand. It's an error-prone process. So go ahead and copy it out of the code sample for this video, or one of the other samples on the OneNote developer site. Now we're going to switch down into the session changed event here and go ahead and actually handle what happens once the user does the physical sign-in. Now, session changed will fire even when the actual page loads, so we want to make sure that the sign-in button is actually enabled. By default, it will be disabled until some of the background initiation is done, which the out-of-box sign-in button will do for us. And that means that the next session changed event will only fire once the users actually click that sign-in button and either attempted to sign in or had a sign-in failure. So we can check here if the actual connection status is connected, and if so, we can grab the access token into our temporary string variable, write out the response here to the user. If for whatever reason the status is not connected, so for example there's a failure, we can go ahead and write that out as well. Moving on here to the create page button. This one we want to be asynchronous because we're making an asynchronous call to the REST services. So let's go ahead and mark that. And we'll also give a little bit of output to the user, tell them that the request is in progress. Next, we'll make sure that the open page in browser button is still hidden in case the users hit the create page button a few times. And after that, we'll create the HTML payload, the actual payload to create a new page in the OneNote API. Now, I'm just going to paste this in to save a little bit of time. But you can see if you've worked with HTML before that this is just relatively standard HTML. It's a subset of regular standard HTML. So you'll see a title tag, a head tag, for example. Notice the created tag there as well, which is a meta tag, and it's going to contain the timestamp for the time that the page was created. It needs to be in a very specific format though. You'll see the toString O there. This is to ensure that it's in a very specific ISO format, and also that it caters for local time zone offsets. Next, the primary body of the page, you can see multiple paragraph tags there, for example, some bold and italicized text, a hyperlink, and even an image included. Now that we have this HTML payload, we're going to go ahead and create a HTTP message to attach it to. On the message, we'll specify that it must be a post message, and we'll specify the endpoint for the actual call. And the content we'll specify as the HTML that we just created a few moments ago. Note that the OneNote API requires the encoding to be specifically in UTF-8, and we'll also go ahead and specify that it's a text HTML payload coming up. So we have the actual content that we want to post. We wrapped it in a message, and finally we'll fire up an HTTP client to go and physically make the call. On the client, we need to set a couple of headers. So first off, we'll set an authorization header. So this is where we're going to pass the access token that we acquired earlier from the sign-in button, and we pass it through something called a bearer header. So we'll add that guy, and next we'll specify that we want to accept a JSON payload coming back. So we'll specify that as application JSON. And finally, we make the actual call. We're going to do that asynchronously again, and we're going to return the result into an HTTP response message that we can use later to inspect the response to make sure that the status code is correct, that the create actually succeeded, and also look at the payload that comes back. So let's create another method here to actually work with the response, just to keep our code a tiny bit tidier. We can go ahead and generate that method stub and then work inside of there. The first thing we're going to do is check whether the message was or whether the page was created successfully and whether the message came back okay. So we're going to check the status code, and we're going to look specifically for a created status code, a code of 201. So this is what the API returns if it was able to successfully create the page. If that worked okay, then again asynchronously we'll go ahead and read the response body as a stream or as a string out of the stream, and we can go ahead, for example, and write it out for the user to see. Again, recall, just for development purposes, we're going to write out a raw payload here, but it'll enable us to see what the payload looks like coming back from the actual service. And once we've done that, we're going to parse the payload into a dynamic object here. We're going to use the JSON parser that we specified earlier when we were putting down our NuGet packages, and we're going to deserialize the actual payload object. And then off that object, we're going to pull specifically the web URL to the newly created page. Now we need to be careful here with the dynamics, so let's just specify exactly which properties and sub-properties that we want to go ahead and make use of. So off of the links collection, we specifically want the OneNote web URL that's going to come back, and we want to get the href. We're going to store that in the new page URL so that when the user clicks the Open Page in Browser button in a few moments, we can go ahead and actually open the web browser on the Windows Phone device and pass forward that page URL. Of course, we can then go ahead and make sure that the button to launch a browser is visible as well. If anything goes wrong, if a non-201 response comes back, so let's say a 404 comes back, if we specified the endpoint correctly or anything along those lines, we're just going to show the user what the actual response code is that comes back. And finally, when they click the Open Page in Browser button, we need to go ahead and launch the web browser on the phone. So to do that, we first just going to make sure that the URL has been set and they haven't accidentally clicked this button some other way. And then we'll fire up a web browser task on the phone, which is how on the Windows Phone device we go ahead and launch an actual web browser passing it a URL. So let's instantiate the new instance there, and then on the instance we're going to pass it the URL to go to. Now it's a URI, so we'll specify it as a URI, but we also need to tell it directly that it's an absolute fully encoded URI. So it's not, for example, a URI within a web application here that we're building. And finally, we'll go ahead and show the actual web browser task, effectively launch the browser and direct it at the URL that we want to go to. Okay, let's see if there's anything we need to tidy up. There's an async I can see missing there. Let's just run our application, also see if there are any other loose ends that need to be taken care of. So yeah, we can see there's a hanging semicolon there. I also want to actually just check the JSON response. Again, being a dynamic object, we need to be very careful to make sure that we've typed things correctly. And in fact, I can see that the link is incorrect there. It's a collection of links. So let's just pluralize that and go ahead and run our application. We can see the Windows Phone emulator loading up here, and once it's all fired up and booted the device, we can go ahead and run our application. So you can see the output window as well. There's installing the application onto the device, and we'll load our phone app in just a moment. Well, that was fast. It's loaded up already. Notice that the sign-in button is enabled, so it's done the initialization. Notice the little cloud icons there as well. So I'm going to click sign in. I'll get taken to the Windows Live portal to go ahead and enter my credentials. So I'm going to pause the frame on the video just to enable me to do that, and go ahead and do the sign in. When I come back, it's prompting the user to approve of the actual requests that we made in the scopes setting. So the 3 permissions that we asked for: the ability to sign in, access the details on a regular basis without nagging the user, and of course to create new pages in OneNote are all appearing there. So I'm going to go ahead and accept those 3 permission requests. It will do the authentication. You can see the authentication is successful there, and we can now go ahead and create the sample page into the OneNote API. So it's sending the request to the service, and if everything's successful, we should see our success message coming back and the payload being written out here directly onto the screen. So there our message has come back, and we can see the JSON payload, so the links collection, and the 2 links that come back. The one at the top you'll see has a OneNote protocol. So on the desktop, for example, if we were to launch that URL, it would launch the actual OneNote client directly. But the web URL in this case is the one we're going to use, and it will go ahead and launch the browser on the phone directly. Now I've fired up the emulator from fresh, so it's the first time the browser's launching. I'm going to go ahead and accept the recommended settings. And in going to the new OneNote page, it's going to first try and authenticate me in the browser against the live services. So once again, I'm going to capture my username and password here. This, of course, is the user's standard Microsoft account. And once that's done, it will direct me to the page in the browser. By default, on a Windows phone, the OneNote client is installed, so the web page will detect that it's a Windows phone and try and direct you to the actual OneNote client on the device and open the page there. But on the emulator, the OneNote client has some known issues, so I want to load it in the full browser, and I'm going to go ahead and request the full desktop browser so that we can see the page opening here. On an actual test device, it should load OneNote correctly and take the user to the new page as well. Notice we're in OneNote Online there, that the new page is rendering in the background there and rendering the image and the link and so on. So in this video, we've seen how to use the OneNote API from a Windows Phone device, how to handle the authentication and so on using the Live SDK, how to go ahead and post messages to the OneNote REST service and parse the responses that come back via JSON as well. Remember that you need a client ID, so check out the other video in this series that deals with how to get the client ID in the Windows Store. Thanks for watching. Hello and welcome to this video. This is Hilton Gieseneau, and in this video we're going to see how to create a new Windows Store application to speak to the OneNote API. So we're going to start off here in Visual Studio, and off of the File menu we're going to go ahead and create a new project. We'll create a Windows Store application, of course, but let's give it a slightly more descriptive name here, and go ahead and hit OK. Now, once the new project is created, because we're calling against the OneNote API, which is part of the Windows Live services, which are in turn making use of OAuth to do the actual authentication, we have to have some kind of key or identifier for our application in order to call the services. If we're using let's say a Windows Phone app or an iOS app, for example, we would use a client ID. But because we're building a Windows Store app, we need to go ahead and create a store association in the application itself. So off of the project menu under Store, we can go ahead and choose to associate an app with the store. If we haven't signed in yet, we'll need to go ahead and do an actual sign-in. So I'm just going to pause the video for a moment while I capture my sign-in details. And there we go. We come back and go ahead and create a new application to link. We could use an existing application, so you can see I have one listed there. In this case, I'm going to go ahead rather and reserve a new application name. Now, it's important to note you do need an actual Windows Store account, of course, in order to create an application entry in the Windows Store. So let's go ahead and choose an application name which, although not all that sensical, not something that would look great as a real application name in the store, is guaranteed pretty much to be unique for demo purposes here. So reserve that app name. You'll see it appearing up at the top there, and you've seen that I can go ahead and use an existing name or go ahead and choose a new one. Once I do so, I get this store association appearing into the application. If I don't do this, then at runtime, the application will error out with an object reference not set. In the first stage in building our application, we're going to go and just put a bit of UI together here. So again, nothing too clever, it's just a demonstration application, so not the most sterling user interface, but we've got a button here to go ahead and sign in to the Windows Live Services, and then one to go ahead and actually create a new page into the OneNote API. And a text block to write out the results at the bottom. Again, also not using the sort of more recommended practices, I guess you could say, in terms of things like MVVM data binding and so on. I'm just going to set the enabled property to false directly, and we'll change that through the code behind. Naming my buttons more appropriately, and as well the text block down at the bottom there. And at this point we could start writing code, but because we're talking against the Live API, we want to go ahead and use the Live SDK that's available for us. So I'm going to install that directly here through the Package Manager console. You can of course use the user interface. I prefer to use the console to go ahead and install packages, so let's give that a moment to install. I'm using the latest version, of course, using Package Manager there, and you can see that the current version is 5.6. Now before we can call directly, we need to go ahead and do a little bit of setup in our application. So we're going to go ahead, for example, and create something called scopes. And scopes are effectively the permissions that we want our application to be able to make use of. So for instance, we'll see in a moment we want to be able to do an actual sign-in against the live services, and so on. We'll see those in a minute. I'm just going to store those in a string array here as a private member in the class. And here's where I'll go ahead and request the specific scopes or permissions. So we'll do a sign-in as well as also doing requesting something called offline access. Offline access isn't critical at this point. We could write our application without it, but it effectively gives our application the permission to go ahead and request services on the user's behalf without continually nagging them for a login. And then in terms of the OneNote services, which is of course what we're interested in this video, we're requesting the ability to go ahead and create new notes in the user's OneNote notebook. Next up, being that we're calling a REST service, we obviously need to go ahead and specify the address for the service we want to call. So I'm just going to call that the pages endpoint here and go ahead and specify the URI. In the interest of safety, we are rather going to paste that URI in, so copy it out of the code for this video or out of the samples on the OneNote site, just to make sure we don't get any typos appearing in there. And then to authenticate against the live services, I'm going to make use from the SDK of something called the Live Auth client here, which will handle the authentication for us, and then something called the Live Connect client to go ahead and handle the actual connection and session status and state and so on. And one last step before we can get to the main sign-in code is also to do some basic initialization of the live services, so connecting our application in the background to the live services so that we could do a sign-in and any of the other operations that we'll need to perform later on. Everything's going to be asynchronous, being that we're in a Windows Store app here, and we'll do some very lightweight exception handling. So if anything goes wrong, we can just, for example, go ahead and write out the exception to the text block. Now let's get into the actual initialization process. So I'm going to fire in a login result object here and go ahead and do an initialization operation on the Live Auth client, passing in the scopes that we want to request as well. Notice again, everything asynchronous here, and if all of that succeeds, then we can go ahead and actually enable the sign-in button. So once the background initialization has been successful, the user will be able to, at first stage, sign in, and at second stage, go ahead and actually create the application. The sign-in process looks very similar, except that instead of doing an initialization, we're going to do a login in a moment. But we can also be more explicit with our exception handling here, so we're going to go ahead and capture a live auth exception. And of course we could do capture standard exceptions and so on and do logging as we need it. But it's important to note that we can do more targeted exception handling at this point as well. And finally, let's go and do the actual login operation here as well. Again, everything asynchronous. At this point we can check the status of the actual login result and see if we are in fact connected. If so, then we can enable the create page button. We can write some response out to the user here. So we'll go ahead and just put a status into the response text block. And perhaps most important of all, we can go ahead and new up the actual Live Connect client, passing in the session details for the actual recent signed in session. Let's do the async on this guy too. And next up, the most exciting part, we can go ahead and actually wire up our create page button too. So I'm going to put all of the create page code into a method on its own. Inside here, we'll do a little bit of exception handling as well. Again, just writing it out to the text block in case anything goes wrong. Now, being that we're calling a REST service, we can go ahead and new up an HTTP client to actually make the REST call, attach a couple of headers, which we'll do in a moment, and then post an actual payload to create the new page. So we'll first set an accept header to go ahead and say that we want to work with a JSON payload that will come back from the service. And next we'll attach our actual authentication token as well. So it's something called a bearer token. And to this we'll actually attach the token that came back on the actual authentication process itself. So we'll attach our access token over there. And next we'll define an actual payload. So let's do it as a string. It'll just be a block of HTML. To save us a little bit of time, I'm going to copy paste that in rather than type out all the HTML. But it's important we actually look at the HTML. Let's do that for a moment. So if you've worked with HTML before, done any web development, for example, you'll recognize a head tag, a body tag, a title tag, and so on. We're also capturing a created date over there, but notice that the date is in a very specific format off of the actual datetime object. So we're doing a toString with the O format, which you'll see caters for a specific ISO format, but in addition specifically catering for local time zone offsets as well. So it's a standardized date time stamp across the world, across all the regions. If we look at the actual payload itself, you'll see that we can do formatting in there like paragraph tags, italicized text, bold text, and so on. Also inserting a hyperlink and inserting an image that we'll see hopefully appearing later in the video. So we have our payload, we have our client, HTTP client defined. Let's go ahead and put that payload into an actual message. We'll specify that we're going to do a post here, which is what we need for a create operation. We'll set the actual endpoint itself. Next, we'll attach the sample HTML as the payload to the message. It's important to make sure that we set the text formatting, the text encoding correctly as well. So we're going to specify here that we want to make use of UTF-8 encoding, and also that we're passing in HTML content so that the server knows what to expect. And finally, we'll go ahead and do the call itself. Again, using asynchronous, so we'll call, so we'll do an await there and do an asynchronous send of the message we've just created, retrieve that response, and then do whatever we want with the response itself. In order to show you what the response details look like, I'm going to write it straight out to the text block again, but I'm going to write the response object directly, which will effectively just be the headers, and then I'm going to show the response body out to you as well so that you can see the important information that appears in there. The headers will show us things like whether or not the application was successful or the call was successful, and the body will show us links, for instance, to the newly created page, so we could direct the user there in a browser, for example. We can go ahead and run our application. We see the Windows Store container firing up. The initialization is taking place there, so the sign-in takes a moment or two to actually go ahead and occur. The first time we use our application, because there are specific permissions that we're requesting, the user will be prompted to go ahead and accept the permission, and each of the three permissions there maps to one of the scopes that we defined earlier in our application. So the sign-in capability, the ability to refresh the tokens that it needs to actually process the ability to access the services on an ongoing basis without nagging the user continually, and finally, of course, the ability to create new pages in OneNote. So we'll go ahead and accept those permissions. We do trust this application, after all, we wrote it. And finally, once the sign-in is successful, you'll see the response written out there, the fact that we signed in, and the Create Page button becomes enabled as well. So the call's happening in the background. We can see the response coming back. The first part is the header section up at the top there, for example, seeing that a created occurred and a status of 201, a success. And then down at the bottom, the actual payload contains two links. The first directly to the OneNote client app, so if we were to pass that on using the OneNote protocol, for example, it would fire up the OneNote application on the desktop and take us directly to that page. Or we get a URL so that on a device, for instance, we could fire up the web browser and take the user directly to that OneNote page in the browser. And as a final step, let's pop over into the actual OneNote client running on the desktop here. You see the sync occurring there. And finally, the new page appears in short order. We can see the formatting on the text there, for example, the italicized text, the bold text, the link, and even the image appearing. It's important to know that notes will, by default, get created in the user's quick notes section as the last note in the section. In future videos, we'll see how to create that note into specific sections and do things like move the notes around as well. So a quick summary. In this video, we've seen how to go ahead and create a new application, sign up with the application tokens that we need in order to associate our app and get tokens to authenticate against the live services in a Windows Store app. We've seen how to do the initialization, the sign-in, and the actual create page operation using the API provided off of the Windows Live SDK. If you've got any questions, you can go ahead and contact us via the contact details on the video page, where you can also get the code sample download as well. Hey, this is Hilton Gieseneau, and in this video we're going to learn how to call the OneNote API to create a new page from within an Android application. So we're going to start off here in the Eclipse IDE, and we're going to go ahead and create a new Android project. We'll give it a name, of course, something that reflects what we're trying to do, so just a sample for now, and then we'll leave all the defaults for all the remaining steps in the process. Once the new project is created, let's just clean up our development environment here. Go ahead and make a bit more space. Once the project is created, we can go ahead and put a little bit of UI together to go ahead and add some buttons and a little bit of text area for some output. So we'll wrap our existing containers a little bit to make sure everything flows nicely. Once that's done, we'll go ahead and set some properties on our text view, and then go ahead and add two buttons onto the form. The first button will handle the actual sign-in process that we'll see in a short while, and the second button will go ahead and do an actual create page. So I'm just resizing the text area there, and then setting the properties here on our buttons. Let's make sure things flow nicely, so I'm going to take off some of the default padding options there on the layout, and then go ahead and set the properties on our buttons. So the first button is going to be the sign in. We'll make the text there say sign in, and the second button is going to be our create page button. Now the create page button is going to be disabled by default, and it will only be enabled once the sign-in process is complete. So I'm going to give it an ID so that we can refer to it from our code and go ahead and set it later, and wire up some event handlers here as well for both sign-in and create page. And then let's give our text view an ID as well, so that we can go ahead and refer to that from our code later on as well. Take out the default text there too. The last step is to disable a button, as we said there, and from there we can jump into our actual activity class and go ahead and start coding. So first up, let's work with the text property. Let's go ahead and configure some basic logging. Of course, in a real application, you wouldn't go ahead and write logging data directly out to the user, but it's fine just for a demo application here for development purposes. So any output, any exceptions that we need to, the actual response from the create message, the actual HTTP payload, and so on, we're going to log out here. So just a very simple logging mechanism for now. So we'll take in a string here to the log function. And then, of course, this needs to run on the UI thread. So we'll go ahead and enable that. And we'll go ahead and set the actual property onto the text view itself. So let's give it a better name here for our actual text view, and then we'll go ahead and do the actual appending of the characters. We'll append so that the full log will appear on the screen, and we'll go ahead and write out the actual text that we've sent in. So that's a very simple log, but again, enough for a very simple demo application that we're building here. Next up, let's wire up the actual sign-in button. Now, in order to do the sign-in and acquire the credentials and do the basic authentication and so on that we need against the live services, of which OneNote is a part, we're going to make use of the Windows Live SDK that Microsoft have produced for the Android client. So you can see here, this is the Live SDK we're looking at, and we can see it off of the GitHub account here. You can see the full URL up at the top there, github.com/liveservices/live-SDK for Android, with a dash between it before and after the 4. We're going to download the zip file here, and I've downloaded it already. So I'm just going to switch to the Windows Explorer here, go ahead and extract the files, and then bring them into Eclipse in a moment. We're going to go ahead and import the SDK code. So I'm going to bring in the download application here. You'll notice that there are 4 projects. There's the core source code, then some unit tests, utilities, and sample, and so on. We're just going to bring in the primary source because that's all we need to do the authentication in our project here. Now we're going to set the properties here, make sure that we're targeting the correct version of the Android platform, and then we should be able to use the Live SDK components that we've just brought in. The first one we're going to look at here is the Live Auth client, which will of course go ahead and handle the actual authentication against the live services. Now, the OneNote API is a REST-based API, so we'll be making a raw HTTP call later and posting a payload and so on. But it also makes use of OAuth to go ahead and handle the authentication. So one of the things we need to do in order to make a call to the service is to make use of a client ID. So I've registered an application in the Microsoft Account Developer Center, and there's another video in this series that covers how to go ahead and do that and capture an application logo, title, and so on. So I refer you to that video to go ahead and find out all of the steps involved, and what we need to pull out of that is the client ID that you'll see I've captured in here directly. So we need that client ID in order to be able to do the auth. So I'm just going to hard code it here for now. I'm going to be at least a little bit better practice and go ahead and pull that out into a constant up at the top here. And next up, off of that live client, we can go ahead and do a login. So we need to pass it the current activity that we're making a call from, of course. But we also need to pass it a series of strings here. And these are something called scopes, as you can see there. Scopes against the OneNote API or against the Live Services API are effectively the permissions that you're requesting your application to be able to perform on the user's behalf. So for instance, we want to go ahead and do a sign-in operation against the Windows Live Services, and then ultimately we're going to do a create of a OneNote page against the Office services as well. And then we're going to request one extra scope here, which is the WL offline access scope, which sends back a refresh token as well, so that when the current token expires, then your app can get a new one without needing to prompt the user all the time. And finally, when the actual login completes, we can hook into the listener here and go ahead and handle both the error condition and the complete condition as well. You'll notice here that we have a live auth exception, so if anything goes wrong, we can go ahead and get more specific details off of this exception type. But now I'm just going to log the message out to the log message that we created, effectively just append it to our text view. And then if everything works correctly, then we will go to the onAuth complete method here. And you'll see here that we get a status, so we can go ahead and confirm whether the actual status was able to connect completely. So that might not be because an exception occurred, might be that, let's say, the user canceled the operation or something like that. So we can see here that in this case, if everything did connect correctly, we can once again just log so that we know in our app that everything's going correctly and successfully. And then most importantly, off of the Live Connect session, we want to go ahead and get hold of the token that comes back. Now you'll notice there are three different kinds of tokens that come back: access token, an authentication token, and a refresh token, obviously if we do need to refresh the session over time. We're going to make use here of the access token, and what we're going to do is store it into a local field that we're going to make use of later when we want to issue the actual create page command. So it's important that we store that token, and right now it's just stored in a local scope token there, but we'll later. And if everything works successfully, the actual authentication is completed, then we can enable the create page button that's disabled by default. And let's just move that token up to be a wider scope than it had by default there. Now that the sign-in process is complete, we can go ahead and work with the create page method. So this, of course, is the most exciting piece of what we're trying to do here. Everything is has just been building up to this thus far. And inside of the create page, we're going to define the definition for an actual page payload inside of the OneNote API, and then make the call to go ahead and send that payload. Now, to save some time, I'm just going to go ahead and copy paste a sample that I've prepared before. So I'm not going to type all of this HTML, but it's interesting to note that effectively the page in OneNote, the actual definition of a page, makes use of a subset of HTML. So if you're familiar with HTML, if you've done web development, for example, you'll recognize all of the tags inside here. For example, a head tag, body tag, paragraph tag, even some formatting, an actual hyperlink tag there, and even an image embedded into that, which the OneNote client will actually download and embed into the actual document once the page has arrived in the client. But essentially, it's just an HTML payload. Now, the created timestamp is one difference here, and that is a timestamp that will appear just below the title in the actual OneNote notebook. And it's important that that timestamp be in a very specific date format. It makes use of something called the ISO 8601 time format. So we're making use of the simple date format class off of the Android API. And you can see the reference to that actual date format appearing here on developer.android.com/reference/java/text/simple-date-format.html. So if you want to go ahead and read up more about that and understand the syntax and the details of this timestamp, you can do so. But you'll see here that we actually get on this page the actual date format that we need to make use of. And as I said, that handles international date standards, but it also specifically handles local time zone offsets as well. So I'm going to make use of the simple date format class here, and I'm going to go and define the actual definition for that specific ISO date format. Once we've done that, we can go ahead and make use of that date in the meta tag there. After that, I'm going to define the actual HTTP request and response process. So I'm going to make use of an async task here, and we're going to issue the actual REST service request. Now, of course, you could make use of some of the standard REST libraries here. I'm going to not do that in this particular video, just to make sure that everything's clear in case there's a library that I would have used that's not something that you're familiar with. In later videos, we'll use some of the more standard HTTP libraries here. But as I said, I'm going to do the heavy lifting here and do the full work. So I'm going to issue this task in the background. I'm going to write out to the log here as well, just so that the user can see that the request is in progress. I'm going to define the URL here. Now, once again, I'm going to copy paste, and this one's not to save us time because it's not a very long URL, but I'm going to copy paste just to make sure that we don't have any errors in typing and transferring that URL. So I'd advise you to do the same. Make sure to copy the URL out of the code sample for this video or any of the documentation for the OneNote API, just to make sure that you don't get any errors introduced by having the wrong URL. So I'm just going to define that as the actual OneNote endpoint. In fact, maybe let's be a little bit more specific and define it here as the create page endpoint for the OneNote service. Once we've defined that URL, we can go ahead and open the actual connection. So let's define a connection variable to hold that state. And then rather than just a generic URL connection here, I'm going to define that as an HTTP connection. Go ahead and do the cast there as well. Now, of course, once we're making a call to an external service, there's a chance that something could go wrong. So I'm going to wrap that in a very lightweight exception handler here as well. Once again, if anything goes wrong, just going to log the exception message straight out to the text view. Of course, in a real world application, you'd go ahead and be a little bit more explicit with your exception handling, with your error reporting, and so on to the user as well. Now, off of our connection, we're going to both define input, so we're going to send in the actual payload that we created above. We're going to define input and output to handle also the response that comes back later on. I'm going to specify that I'm issuing a post request here as well, so I'm setting the request method. And then there are some very specific properties that we need to set on the actual outbound call. So we need to specify the content type, for example, as text HTML, so that the service knows what to expect, to make sure that there's no chance of any inconsistencies there. And likewise, we're going to specify to the server that we want to explicitly request application JSON. Right now, the service only returns JSON code, but that may change, of course, in future. So to future-proof our application there, we're going to be more explicit about our accept tag there. Next up, for the authorization, we are going to be passing something called a bearer token, again, because we're making use of OAuth here. So we're going to pass that as a bearer token here, and we're going to send in the access token that we retrieved earlier via the sign-in process. So we've set all the headers that we need to. The next thing we're going to do is handle the actual payload. So we're going to go ahead onto the outgoing stream and actually submit the HTML payload that we created earlier. So I'm going to send in the HTML, but notice specifically that I'm sending it in UTF format. The OneNote server specifically requires text to come in the UTF-8 format. Finally, I'm going to flush out the stream and close it out. So I'll log that the actual request is complete at this point, and once it comes back, we can actually write out the response. So I'll start by writing out the response code so that we make sure that the correct code is coming back. We are issuing a create operation, after all, to actually go ahead and create a new page. So we should expect an HTTP 201, which is a created response, and we can watch out for that when we do our test later on. And then finally, we're just going to log the raw stream that comes back as text, as JSON text, straight out to the user, so that we ourselves can just see that everything's coming back correctly, and also so that you can see specifically the type of response that comes back from the create operation. Now, to save some time again, I've got a method here in the clipboard which will convert the returning stream straight into a string. So you can see the method up there, and obviously you'll get it in the code download as well. I'm not going to step through that or talk through that too much. It's a pretty standard operation. Going to do one or two more tidy ups here. Just make sure everything is working correctly. So one or two final little tweaks here, and in fact I spot one bug there as well. I've used the write UTF method, but that won't actually write out to UTF-8. I need to specifically do get bytes on the HTML here. Make sure to get UTF-8. And we should be good to go with our application. Just one final setting here. In the manifest, we are, of course, going to be making a call out to the internet. So I'm just going to go ahead and make sure that we request that permission from our users for the actual application. With that done, we can go ahead and actually run our application. So we can see it loading up there. We're just going to set some of the logging details and switch back to our application. So the first thing we're going to do is hit the sign in button. When we do, you'll see that we switch through to the actual Microsoft account sign in page. So I'm going to sign in with my details, but I'm just going to pause the video for a moment while I punch in my account and password details. Okay, we're back. I've clicked the sign in button and you can see that the actual sign in is completed successfully, and the app is now specifically requesting of the user to confirm the permission for our application to go ahead and perform the operations that we defined in the scopes section. So if you followed along with the client ID video in the series, you'll see that this is matching the logo and the actual name and so on, the privacy cookies and terms and so on that we defined for our application. And the scopes that are appearing in the middle here are the ones that we've defined in our Android app here. The ability to sign in, to access the info on a regular basis, and of course ultimately the ability to create new pages in OneNote on the user's behalf. So I'm going to accept those permissions. You can see the actual sign-in is completed and we connected, and I'm going to go ahead and click the create page button and actually see our HTTP call fire off to the server and the response come back. So it's come back quite quickly. You can see there the actual response 201 as expected. So the new page creation is completed successfully. Obviously we could look at the headers and investigate more fully if we needed to. But most importantly, have a look at the actual response payload that's come back here as well. So inside of the JSON, you can see there's a links collection and that there are two types of links that have come back. The one is a client URL. So that, for example, is prepended with a OneNote protocol. So for instance, if we were on the desktop, this would go ahead and load the full OneNote desktop client and take us to the new page that was created. We also get down at the bottom here the OneNote web URL, which is a full HTTP reference to the actual newly created page that we can launch, for example, in the browser on the device. Or to wrap us up for this video, we're going to go ahead and load that URL up in the full browser-based version of OneNote. So I'm just going to pop into the OneNote client here in the browser. I'm going to go into my OneNote notebook here for my demo account that we're using. And the OneNote page should be created here inside of the default notebook for the user. Later on in the series, in later videos, we'll see how to create a page in a very specific section. But by default, new pages will be created in the user's quick notes section. And the new page that we created is appearing. So in this video, we've seen how to go ahead and call the OneNote API. We've seen how to handle the sign-in using the LiveAuth SDK that handles all of the heavy lifting for us there. And we've seen how to go ahead and issue a create operation using the HTML formatting and payload and so on. In future videos, we'll expand on this to see how to embed content into the page, how to create the page in new sections, and so on. Okay, thanks for watching.
Hey, this is Hilton Giesno. Welcome to another video in the OneNote Developer video series. In this video, we're going to find out how to create a new OneNote page by using the OneNote API from within an ASP.NET MVC application. Now, the OneNote API makes use of OAuth for its authentication, and this means that we need to get a client ID and a client secret, as well as one or two other things that we need to set up in the Microsoft Account Developer Center. There is another video in this series which talks through how to get a client ID specifically for a web application. So check that video out and find out all the details and all the steps involved. If you followed along with that video, you'll recognize some of the settings in these screens that I'm going to show now. But essentially, we need to do two things. We need to get from the API settings the actual redirect URL that we are going to be using inside of our application. So whatever we configure here in the portal needs to match our actual application itself so that the callback can be validated and ultimately that our app can be called back to from the Microsoft OAuth capability. And then in addition, you'll see a link on this page down at the bottom there to app settings, or in the left menu as well, there's a link to app settings. And when I go ahead and open that up, inside of here appear our client ID and the client secret that we are going to use in our application. With that done, we can head over to Visual Studio and start building our app. So in Visual Studio here, I'm going to go to the File menu, create a new project, and we're going to create a standard ASP.NET web application using Visual Studio 2013 here. So let's give it a name. I'll call it a OneNote web app. I'm going to use the MVC template, not build it as an Azure application, just to work locally to keep things simple for now. As always, the caveat with any kinds of demos, I'm not going to use very good practices necessarily for the app. I'm going to use things that are really going to save us as much time so that we can focus on what we're trying to do in this video, dealing with the OneNote API. Now, one thing that is important because of the OAuth as well is because of the callback URL that we needed to specify, and the fact that that URL needs to work both on dev and ultimately obviously into production as well, we want to go ahead and set up a URL on our local development machine that is a fully qualified live domain name, exactly as it will appear when our app goes into production. So before we even start working with code, I'm going to go to the properties of our project, head over to the web section here, and actually configure our application to run even on the local machine under that fully qualified domain name. So I'm going to set here that we will use IIS Express. I'm going to overwrite the application root URL to the one that you can copy out of the portal there when you create your client ID. Going to go here and create the virtual directory as well, and this will create an entry for IIS Express to go ahead and run our application. It's important to know that you can only do this if you are running Visual Studio as an administrator. So you can see that in the title bar of the IDE here that the Visual Studio is running as an admin. And once that's done, we also need to go ahead and modify the actual IIS Express settings to configure it to run on port 80 and so on. So I'm going to set the URL for the start URL for our site as well for when the project runs under the start action setting here. And then I'm going to load the IIS Express config file as well. So that's in my docs IIS Express config and then application host.config. Inside of the file here, the application host config, which has just appeared on my other monitor, I'm just going to drag it over here. I'm going to search for the OneNote app that we just created, and you can see the site appearing inside here. I need to go ahead and change the binding information. The protocol will stay the same, it's still running on HTTP, but I'm going to set that it must run on port 80, and also that it must run, instead of under the local host address, under the fully qualified domain name there, www.onenotedemowebsite.com, which again matches what we had in the application developer portal. And finally, I need to go into my hosts file, and I'm going to create an entry that will resolve this fully qualified domain name, OneNoteDemoWebsite.com, to actually run on the local machine, so that when we hit it in the browser, it will resolve to the local machine rather than trying to go out over the live internet. So we can save those changes across the files, and I'm actually just going to run our application, even blank, just using the template here, just to make sure that all of that is resolving correctly. And you can see that the page is loading as expected in the browser. So it's using the default scaffolding that's been created here for our MVC application, the default web page and routes and so on. Okay, at this point we can get to some actual code. So I'm going to start with the layout in the shared view here, and go ahead and just add a new menu item up at the top of the page to handle the actual creation of our new OneNote page. So I'll call the action link here create OneNote page. I'm going to define it as the create new page action, and I'm going to do that on a new OneNote controller that I'm going to create in a moment. So let's head over to controllers. We'll go ahead and add a new controller. We'll use a default empty controller because we're not going to be using CRUD methods. So I'll just create a OneNote controller there, and we can go ahead and set that actual action as well. Before we do, I'm going to paste in a few things here just to save us some time, and also to make sure that we don't have any errors in our typing here. So the first is the actual endpoint for the OneNote API. The second is our client ID and client secret that we would have gotten out of the application developer portal as well, and then the redirect that we would have configured as well in that portal. And finally, the last item there is a string array of scopes, and these are effectively the permissions that you will be calling against the OneNote service on the user's behalf. So the ability, for example, to sign in is the first one that appears there. The request for offline access, which enables you to get a token that will last for much longer, so that you can retain the user's token and create pages on their behalf for a much longer period. And finally, the actual ability to create pages in the OneNote service against that Microsoft account. After that, we're going to install the Live SDK, and it will enable us, for example, to do authentication and handle all the redirects and so on behind the scenes for us. So I'm going to head here into the Package Manager console, and I'm going to install the package, which is the Live SDK. Now, if you've worked with the Live SDK before, or even if you've, for example, followed along with other videos in this series where we've built native applications, for example, a Windows Phone app, we've installed the Live SDK before, but in a web app, we need to install the Live SDK server package. So note that difference, otherwise you will get a different version of the SDK. It looks similar, but of course the server version has web-specific things that we need. So we will wait for the package to finish installing. Once that package has come down, we're also going to do some JSON parsing on the result that comes back. So I'm going to install the Newtonsoft JSON parser. Let's go ahead and resolve that one. And then the last NuGet package we're going to implement is the HTTP client from Microsoft. So that's in microsoft.net.http. And that completes all of the libraries that we need to get started. So we can switch back to the code. And out of that live SDK, I'm going to make use of the live auth client to handle the actual authentication for us. So I'll declare it here. Let's resolve the namespace and go ahead and declare the actual field that I want to use in my controller. Now the constructor here requires the client ID, the client secret, and the client redirect that we've specified as constants a few moments ago. And with that done, I can head into my action and go ahead and implement the create new page action. Now the live auth client will do some initialization for us and enable us also to implement the redirect to the sign-in services. So inside of our action, the first thing that we're going to do here is to go ahead and call an initialization method off of that live auth client. The result will come back into a live login result object where we could check that everything is working successfully. But essentially it's just doing some background initialization, so nothing too complicated there, and we don't need to worry about the result. We are going to call it asynchronously though, so I'm going to switch my task to being async as well. And then we'll call the initialize web session async method on the live auth client. We'll pass in the current HTTP context to that as well. Once it's initialized, it will enable us to do the redirect. So we're going to do a response.redirect inside of our controller, and we'll redirect to the get login URL result for the actual login services. We'll pass in our scopes so that it's able to pass those through as well, and as part of the actual login, request the correct permissions that we need. And then, as I said, we are not actually rendering a view in this case because we're doing a redirect, so I'll just return null as the action result for this action. Now the next stage is to handle the redirect that comes back from the authentication services. And that's going to be on the URL that we defined. So it will be off of the root for our website and then a redirect path that comes back in. So I'm going to go here into the root config for our MVC application, and I'm going to map that root explicitly to a new action on this current controller. So we'll give it a name here. We'll call it the live callback because that's what it's essentially doing. And under the URL there, we will specify that it is directly off the root a redirect path that's coming back. We'll send it to the OneNote controller, and we'll go ahead and create a new action for this. We'll take off the parameter because we can control that explicitly in our action. So back to the controller, let's go ahead and implement that redirect action. So I'll copy the create new page just to get some of the scaffolding there, the async task and so on. The redirect though should hopefully come back with an authorization token that we can convert into an access request token against the live auth services. So we'll check that that code has come back correctly. If it doesn't, then let's just cater for an error condition there as well. And again, we could make this a bit more robust, perhaps redirect to an error page, for instance. I'm just going to send the user straight back to the index action on the home controller. And again, return null on this particular action that we're implementing though, because it will ultimately redirect if everything is successful. This time we're going to hook into the live auth client again, but this time we will implement the exchange auth code method, which again is asynchronous. And this will, as I mentioned, convert the authorization code into an actual access request token. So again, we'll pass in the current HTTP context. Now this is an MVC application. We obviously need a model as well. So if everything does go successfully, then we will want to return some details out to the user using a model. So I'll implement a OneNote create view model here. And on that view model, I'm going to go ahead and handle a response message. So either a success or failure response message. And then if everything works correctly, then we should get a URL to the newly created page that we can actually browse to straight in the browser. So I'll capture that separately here as well. Let's go back to our controller and just resolve the namespace there and go ahead and try and retrieve the new model. And that new model is going to come back from a create action that we're going to implement here. So we'll pass in the session that comes back from the live authentication client, and we'll pass that into a new method that we'll create in a moment. And if that method is successful, if the create is successful, then we'll call a new view called new OneNote page and pass in the model. Now let's go ahead and implement our actual creation code. To create a new page in OneNote, effectively the content of that page is actually a kind of HTML. It's a subset of standard HTML. So you'll recognize things here like a head tag, a body tag, obviously the HTML tag itself, but even formatting, things like italicized and bolded text, a hyperlink, and even an image that we can embed directly in there as well. The title of the page is also specified using the convention here of the standard HTML title, and the date format that appears on a OneNote page, the timestamp, is specified here using a meta property called created. We can go ahead and just pass the current date time in for that, but notice that the date needs to be in a very specific ISO 8601 format, which caters for localized date formats, particularly for local time zone offsets. And that's all the content that we need to pass in to actually create the new page as its payload. But to do that, being that the OneNote API is a REST service, we need to go ahead and issue the actual HTTP call to the service. So we'll create a full HTTP request message here, define that it's a post message, and of course specify the endpoint as the OneNote API endpoint that we captured up front in a constant. Into that message, we'll go ahead and pass the actual sample HTML payload as the string content. It's important to note here also that the text needs to be encoded using UTF-8 format. If it comes through in another format, you'll get error characters appearing in your output. And then finally, of course, we'll specify that it's HTML text. So we've created the final message. Let's go ahead and define the HTTP client across which to send that message. On the client, we need to set a few headers. First is an authorization header, the actual security details that we want to pass through. And being an OAuth service, we will pass a bearer token, and we'll go ahead and pass in the session token that we need. So off of the Live Connect session, we have access to an access token property, and that's what we're going to pass in. And finally, off of the headers as well, we'll go ahead and specify an accept header to specifically say that we want application JSON data to come back. With that done, we can actually fire off the HTTP request message. So we'll have its response come back here into an HTTP response message object. We'll just call it response, and we'll go ahead and call the HTTP client's send async method asynchronously. So we'll await on that response, go ahead and pass in the actual message as the payload. Of course, we need to make our create method async here as well, just to resolve that error. And once all that's done and the call is hopefully successful, we can go ahead and process the response that's come back. And we'll inspect it to ensure that the actual creation was successful, and then handle the details of showing the user what comes back to. So we are going to return that view model, and that's what we're going to throw across to the view for our controller. So we'll define the new model itself, and then what we'll do is check whether the response was actually successful. Now, the OneNote service is a REST service, so of course we want to use standard HTTP conventions, and one of those is that if a page is created successfully, then we will get an HTTP response code of 201, which is a creation successful. So as I hover over the enumeration value there, you'll see 201 as the response type. And if that came back, then obviously our page was created successfully. So we're going to show the user a little bit of raw output in this video, not something you would do obviously in a live app, but for demo purposes here, it's useful to see the response as it comes back in its raw form. So I'm going to write out the response code, the response status out to the user first, and then we'll write out the raw payload a little bit later too. First, let's capture that payload as it comes back from the HTTP client. So we're going to read the raw payload as a string directly into a payload string variable here, and then we'll decode that payload in its JSON format using the JSON library that we brought into our project. We'll treat it as a dynamic object, which means of course we need to know what the payload looks like so that we can access everything off there. In this particular case though, we are going to access the new link to the newly created page. So the response object contains a links collection. Off of that links collection there are going to be two URLs. You'll see hopefully later in this video if everything's successful. One of those is a web URL, and we'll capture the href property off of that. Let's write that raw response out to the user though as well, so that in our development mode here we can actually see the full response as it comes back. So I'll just put a break to put it on a new line, and then I'll write out the response directly from this payload string. Of course, let's just move that line down so that it's in the right place. This method also needs to be async, so let's implement that, and we'll also implement here an error condition in case the creation was not successful. We obviously won't capture the new link, but we will go ahead and also write a response out to the user. In this case, we will say that the page creation was unsuccessful, it failed, and we can also write a response code out here too, so that the user can see the response status that came back. Okay, we're just about done. Let's return the newly created model up from the process response method into the create method, which in turn will ultimately go up to our redirect action, which will pass that model out to the view. So as a final stage here, let's just go ahead and implement that view. We'll define it as a details template here, and we'll point to the OneNote create view model, of course, to show that data. Now, one of the properties is a string, the other was a URI, so the template generator here is not quite sure what to do with it, but we're just going to deal with it as a string. So we will implement handling for the new page link property as well. And to keep things simple, I'm just going to write it straight out into an anchor tag here. So we'll call it new page, and obviously the link will be the link hopefully to the newly created page. Okay, let's run our application. I've got Fiddler running in the back as well, as you can see. So let's go ahead and click the Create OneNote Page menu item that we defined in our page here. And this should, behind the scenes, fire off a request to the Microsoft account login services here. And you can see that is working successfully. So the redirect is occurring correctly. Notice that it's going to the OAuth 2 authorization portal here. And I can go ahead as an end user and sign in to my account. I'm going to pause the video for a moment just to do that. When I do go ahead and sign in though, it will redirect back to our application and immediately try and create the new page. So let's do that. We head back and you can see the new page has been created successfully. Let's head back to Fiddler. We'll look at the output in a moment, but let's start off by looking at Fiddler, and you can see the actual sequence of calls occurring there. So we go to the create new page off of our OneNote controller in the URL there. We can go ahead and look into the details of that. I'll leave that as an exercise for you as the viewer to do in your own time. And you'll see it's effectively just doing a 302 redirect onto the Microsoft account service login page. And then likewise, you'll see the redirect coming back there as well, with the code being returned as the query string parameter there. So we captured that code, we went ahead and did the actual call against the OneNote API a little bit further down the actual Fiddler activity stream there. That was successful, so let's head back to our application, see the response written out. So you can see the new page created successfully there, the actual response message coming back, and notice that the links collection has come back correctly there too. So we have a collection of two links. The first is a OneNote client URL, and this is a URL that is prepended with a OneNote protocol. So on the desktop here, for example, if I was to try and fire up that URL, it would load my new page directly in the full OneNote desktop client. But notice also that we have a OneNote web URL, and this is the one that we made use of to define our new page link down at the bottom there. So I can either click that link, or I'll also just go ahead and copy the URL. Also will of course work successfully. So I'm going to paste it into the browser here and wait for the OneNote web client to load and direct us straight to the newly created page. So you can see our new page was created successfully. Things like the title, the formatting, all the content, even the image at this point will get downloaded from the URL that was specified there and embedded into the page at this point too. A last important point, notice that the page will get created at the end of the user's quick notes section. In a later video, we'll look how to create a page in a specific section, but if that's not specified, then new notes will go by default into the user's new notes section. So in this video, we've seen how to authenticate using OAuth 2 against the OneNote API, and how to go ahead and create a new page from within an ASP.NET MVC application. This has been Hilton Giesener. Thanks for watching.
Hello and welcome to another video in the OneNote Developer Videos series. This is Hilton Giesener, and in this video we're going to find out how on the Windows Phone device to access all of the user's notebooks and the sections within those notebooks. An individual user may have more than one notebook that they've got access to via the OneDrive storage. So as an example, this demo user has a default notebook called Demos Notebook, and inside of that notebook there are three sections listed on the left hand side of the screen. The Quick Notes section, which recall by default is where new notes will go unless otherwise specified, but there's also a Personal Info, Financial Data, and a To-Do Lists section inside of this particular notebook. But this user has another notebook altogether, something called Work Notebook, and if I go inside of there, there is a Company Info section as well as a Clients section group. Within that, two subsections, Client 1 and Client 2. Now, we're not going to focus on section groups within this video, but the concepts are identical. So whatever applies to notebooks and sections will apply to section groups as well. But we'll see how section groups and sections are dealt with as we start reading from the API. So let's switch over into Visual Studio. As a starting point for this video, we are going to have the sign-in capability using the Windows Live SDK done for us already. So the Live SDK as well as the Newtonsoft JSON libraries have been imported via NuGet packages to this application. And in addition, I have a little bit of UI wired up here as well. So I have a stack panel with the Live SDK sign-in button, as well as a button to get the notebooks. You'll notice that it's disabled for now, so once the sign-in is complete, we'll be able to get the notebooks. A text block to go ahead and write out any messages to the user, and then a list box for the notebooks available to the user, as well as a list box for the sections available to the user within the specific selected notebook. Now, if you've followed along with the other videos in this series, particularly the video on how to create a new note within OneNote on a Windows Phone device, then many of the controls and certain aspects of the code later on in this video will be familiar to you. One of the things, for example, to notice is the scopes have been configured here already. I need to do a sign-in to be able to actually sign the user into the OneNote services. I'm also making use of offline access here so that I can get a refresh token that I can use to sign the user in over a longer period of time without having to prompt them every time the initial token expires. And finally, I have a OneNote Create scope that I'm requesting as a permission here as well. Now that's of course to go ahead and create the new notebook. In this video, I only want to go ahead and read the user's notebooks and sections, so I can take off the create portion there and just access office.onenote as a permission to go ahead and read the OneNote data. That's the only change we're going to make on the form here. Let's switch over to the code and start actually writing code to call the API and get the notebooks and sections. The pages endpoint may also be familiar to you if you've followed along with the create video in this series. To access the notebooks and the sections, we need an appropriate endpoint for each one of those respectively. So off of the primary API, to get notebooks, we'll hit the notebooks endpoint, for example. But it's important to know that right now, at the time of recording this video, which is late June in 2014, the ability to access notebooks and sections is currently in beta.
So we need to specify that the API we're accessing is the beta API. By the time you watch this video, these services might be fully live and hopefully will appear in an unchanged form as well. But of course, it's important to realize that given that it's in beta right now, things may not be in production exactly in the form that you see in this video. For now though, off of the beta API, I can access notebooks directly, and then I can also access sections directly. But in this video, I would like to only see sections within a specific notebook. So I'll access the notebooks endpoint on the REST API, then go ahead and pass in a specific notebook ID, which we'll get later in this video. And off of that, go ahead and access the sections in that notebook. So we'll see how these endpoints come into play later. Once the user has signed in, using the sign in button there, the sign in has been successful, and the user is successfully connected to the live services, they'll also have an access token, which we'll use later. And finally, the Get Notebooks button is enabled. So inside of the Get Notebooks button click is where we're going to start now, but it's going to be async, so let's go ahead and mark it as such. Also, the notebook list box selection changed is going to be async too, so I'll just wire that up right now. Inside of the Get Notebooks button, we are going to call some asynchronous code, so I'll go ahead and create a new method called Get Notebooks and go ahead and await on that one returning. First, we'll just write something out to the user, let them know that we're currently doing something. So we'll just put a message into the info text block. And then, being that we're calling the REST API, we're going to fire up an HTTP client object and go ahead and set the appropriate headers. Being that we're using OAuth, we need to go ahead and pass in a bearer access token, which we got from the sign-in button. And then I'll also specify an accept header to tell the API that we want JSON data to come back. Now we need to go ahead and specify a request message. Even though we're not going to be sending any payload, we need to go ahead and specify that we're calling an HTTP GET method on the request message. And of course, we also need to go ahead and specify an endpoint too. So this will be the notebooks endpoint that we defined up above. And then we can go ahead and get the response object off of the client call as well. This Get Notebooks method also needs to be async, so let's wire that up. And finally, we can call the send message on the HTTP client asynchronously too. We'll pass in the message, and then we'll deal with the response that comes back. The first thing we'll do with the response is just get the raw payload out of there. So this will contain either an error payload or the notebooks that we're hoping to retrieve. So we'll put it into just a raw string for now. Go ahead and read all of the content on the response object. And then we can also do a check to see whether the response was in fact successful. So if the call came back okay, the HTTP status code of OK should come back. If not, then we'll start off with the error condition, go ahead and just write the status code out to the device, and just write out the raw payload as well. Obviously, in a real production application, we'd be a little bit more rigorous in our error handling, maybe trap the type of error, possibly do a retry, for example, or display it to the user in a more friendly manner, but for development purposes here, we'll just write everything out raw. If the call is successful though, then we want to go ahead and parse the JSON result that comes back. So remember, I'm using the JSON.NET library, and we want to go ahead and deserialize that payload. However, we need to define now what exactly we're going to deserialize that object type into. So a way to get this is to go to the API Console that we can use to call the OneNote API. We're going to the beta API version here, and we're going to go ahead and access the notebooks endpoint. What this will do is give us the raw output of the JSON that comes back. This will obviously be for whatever user you've logged in here. I happen to be using the same user, but the contents of the response are less critical than the actual structure of the response, which is what we want. So I'm going to copy out that response and then head over to another website here, JSON2 C#. So that's JSON, the number 2, and then the full words CSHRP.com. And what this tool will do is let us go ahead and paste in some JSON, and based on the structure that comes back, give us a C# set of classes that we can use to go ahead and deserialize that return.
So in my program, I've created a container class here called Notebooks Response that I've left empty, and I'm just going to paste in the result that comes back from that website. And this is a representation of the deserialized JSON object that's going to come back. The root object contains a property to define the actual data context. Unfortunately, the name is a little bit difficult for the tool to parse, so we're just going to specify that the JSON property that comes back is that @odata.context name. So the deserializer will know what to do with it, but we can give it a more friendly name like context in this case. In addition, the value that comes back for the actual notebooks, or the list of notebooks in this case, also comes back just with a name of value there. So we'll change that into a more friendly name. Let's call the collection of notebooks notebooks. And in addition, the individual type, instead of value, we'll go ahead and call that notebook as well. And then the last change I'm going to do here, just to make things show up better in the list box, is to go ahead and override the toString method for the notebook, and for example insert the name and possibly also just the created by for the author of the notebook there too. Obviously you can change this to whatever you want, but just something to see that everything's working correctly. So if I go back to my application and define now the type that we want to deserialize, it's under the Notebooks Response class, and it's the root object class that we're ultimately going to be returning here. Off of that root object should hopefully be the collection of notebooks defined for the logged in user. So into the list box, onto the items source, I'm going to go ahead and bind all of the notebooks that come back. And once that's done, we'll just go ahead and clear out the info text block and just set a blank message there. At this point, any notebooks that come back should be bound on the screen, and the user should be able to go ahead and select one of the notebooks. So the next step is to go ahead and wire up the selection changed event handler here, and when the user does select one of the notebooks, to go ahead and bring back all the sections in that notebook. So the first thing we want to do is get a reference to the actual notebook that was selected. So on the selection changed event, we can get the added items here. I've set that only a single item can be selected, so accessing item 0 is fine in this case. Again, of course, you can do more robust error handling, but we'll keep things simple for now. And with that done, I can create a new method here to get all of the sections inside of the newly selected notebook. Now the code for this is going to be virtually identical to the get notebooks code. So I'm going to copy all of that and paste it in here and make the few changes that are required. The one thing we need to do is change the endpoint. Of course, this time we want to get the sections inside the notebook, so I'll use that endpoint. But if you recall, there was a token inside there, and that is for the actual notebook ID. So I'll do a string.format there, replace that token with the actual ID of the selected notebook, and this should go ahead and get access to all of the sections inside of that notebook. Let's change the variable name here to something that reflects that a bit better. And we'll go ahead and pass that request in, deal with the response, obviously do the async changes here too, and then access the deserialized object that comes back. Now, just to save us some time, you've seen the process of going ahead and creating a deserializable type there. So I've gone and done that work already to save us a bit of time in this video, and I've called it the notebooks section response, and obviously there's a root object defined off of there as well. I've done the changes for the properties, and I've also done a toString on there as well. Once that's done, we can go ahead and handle the deserialization and pass in all of the sections that come back into the sections list box. And the very last bit of code we're going to write here is on the selection list box select change. So the user's now gone ahead and actually selected one of the sections in the notebook. Let's get a reference to that. And finally, we'll just write a message out to the user here telling them which section was actually selected. So we can access, for example, the name or any other property, or in this case, we'll just do the toString. Okay, let's run our application. This will fire up the emulator as expected, so we'll give the emulator a chance to load there, and then of course to go ahead and actually deploy and run our application. Our application loads successfully. We have the ability to go ahead and hit the sign in button,
This will take us to the sign-in capability for the user's Microsoft account. So I'm just going to pause the video for a moment, go ahead and do the login. And we're back from the login, and we can go ahead and run the rest of our application. Now we do need to go ahead and give the application permission to the permission scopes that we requested. So we see the scopes that we requested reflected here: the ability to sign in automatically, the ability to access the information over a longer period of time with refresh tokens, and then the ability to read all the pages in OneNote. And recall, this was the permission scope that we changed as well. So we'll select yes to that permission. Notice that the details of the application that appear here, so the application name, the terms and privacy settings and all of that, are exactly as we configured them when we defined our application in the Microsoft Account Developer Center. So to find out how to do that and to obtain a client ID to call the OneNote API, you can see an earlier video in the series on how to do this for a native application. So we've gone ahead and approved the permissions there, and the sign-in is complete, and we have the ability now to go ahead and get the notebooks for the user. So we have the request execute when I click the button, and we have all of the notebooks coming back. So I can choose the individual notebooks, flip between them, and have the relevant sections for each of those notebooks returned. In this video, we've seen how to go ahead and call the OneNote API to go ahead and get all the notebooks for the user, and then to get all of the sections inside of the notebooks. In a future video, we'll see how to go ahead and create a page inside of a specific notebook based on the selection, for example, that the user's done here. But we've seen that getting the notebooks and getting the sections is a relatively easy operation. Recall, though, that this is currently the beta of the API, so things may change when the API finally gets to final release. But of course, you can go ahead to the user voice site and submit suggestions on how you'd like to see the API develop over time. One last thing, coming back to the API Console, recall, as I mentioned up front, that there were a few different sections inside of the notebook, but two of them were contained inside of a section group. We haven't dealt with section groups in this video, but the concepts are identical. We can go to the API Console, go ahead and get the definitions for what those section groups look like, create a definition for those classes in our application, and then call the section groups API exactly as you've done for the sections. This has been Hilton Gieseneau. Thanks for watching.
Hello, this is Hilton Gieseneau. Welcome to another video in the OneNote Developer Video series. In this video, we're going to see how, through a Windows Phone application, to create a page inside of a specific section in a user's notebook. Recall by default that when we simply create a new page using the default pages endpoint on the API, then it will get created into the user's default notebook and in turn into the user's default section, which is typically the quick notes section inside of that notebook. Instead, what I can do is specify to have the page created in a specific section. And there are two ways to do this. I've got a quick way, and I've got a button on my form to represent that. And I've got a slightly longer way, which gives us some more flexibility long term as well. This video assumes that you've watched two other videos in the series. The first is to create a new page in the default Quick Notes section on the Windows Phone device. And the second is to go ahead and enumerate the notebooks and the sections within those notebooks for the user's account. So we'll be building on those videos in this series, and let's have a look at what we can go ahead and do to specify a section to go ahead and create the page inside of. So the first thing we're going to do is look at the Quick Create Page button code. And if you followed along with the previous video, you'll recognize this code is almost identical to what we had before. We have a pages endpoint, which is the default pages endpoint on the API, and we can go ahead and create the page inside there to have it appear in the Quick Notes section. The only amendment we're going to do here is to go ahead and add a section name query string variable. And what this will do is allow us in the user's default notebook to specify a section for the page to go into. So we're not providing a notebook name, that's not supported, but we can go ahead and provide a section name. A few important points on the section name. The first is that certain characters are illegal characters inside of the name, and you can refer to the documentation to go ahead and find details on that. The second is that the name needs to be URL encoded. So for example, we're trying to work here with a section called test new section, but we need to be cognizant of the spaces there and insert the %20 characters to go ahead and cater for those spaces. Notice also, if we switch back to the actual user's notebook, that this particular section doesn't exist. There is no test new section inside the user's notebook. However, that's no problem. We can go ahead and fire this code, and what the API will do is look for that new section. It'll go ahead and create that section for us in the process of creating the new note. So let's head back to the browser, and we'll refresh the browser to see the new page created, hopefully inside of the new section as well. So we're back inside of the browser, and the new page has been created, and it's been created in the new section, which itself has been created for us simply by specifying the section name as an additional query string property. Now this is great, but this particular user has multiple notebooks, and we may in fact want to create the page inside of a specific notebook and a specific section in turn. So let's see how to do that. Our phone application here allows us to actually go ahead and get all of the notebooks for the user, and in turn to go ahead and get the sections inside of those notebooks. So for instance, if I go to the to-do lists section as a place where I'd like to create the next sample page, then all our code does is to go ahead and hook into the selection change event on that particular control, and to go ahead and grab out the specific section that the user has selected. So let's for instance go ahead and choose another section, and you'll see that off of the sections themselves we have things like, for instance, the name and so on, but one of the key attributes we have here is a unique section ID. And if we go ahead and choose the section where we'd like the final output to go, then when we click the Create Sample Page button here, I've modified the default Create Page code to check if a section has been selected in our global scope field here. So if it hasn't been selected, then we'll go ahead and use the default endpoint. But if one has been selected, then I'll go ahead and use the endpoint on the API that allows me to create pages inside of the specific section by passing in the specific section ID. So the final endpoint here, by doing some string formatting, is to go ahead and place the section ID inside of the URL, and we'll go ahead and run the rest of the code, and hopefully everything will work correctly to create the new page. So everything looks fine there, and it says that it's created it into the to-do lists section in the user's notebook. So let's go back to the notebook. Once again, I'll just do a browser refresh to have the sync come down a little bit more quickly. And then once it's loaded, we'll go into the to-do lists section and go ahead and see if our page has been created inside there. And it has. We can see our new page has been created inside of the specific section. Now we're just working inside of one notebook here, but the concept is identical if we wanted to have the section be inside of another notebook altogether. That's absolutely fine too. So in this video we've seen two ways that we can go ahead and create a page inside of a specific section. We can either use the section name query string property, which recall will create the new section if it doesn't exist, but does limit us to the user's default notebook, which in many cases will be absolutely fine. But if you do need to specify a specific section in turn inside of a specific notebook, then we've seen how to go ahead and do that too. Okay, thanks for watching.
Hi, this is Farrell Lifson, and today we're going to learn how to post to OneNote using a Ruby application. As you can see on the screen, I've got the Microsoft OAuth 2 page open, and we're going to be using the authorization code grant flow to post to OneNote API and get results back. We're using the OneNote demo site that we set up in the OneNote Application Development Center. This is to be the same for security reasons, and it's set up in our local hosts file that our local host port 80 redirects to OneNoteDemoSite.com. So in our Ruby application, we're going to open up our gem file first. You can see that we're using Sinatra as our web framework. We're going to use Sinatra Contrib to add in some developer features, and Sinatra Flash to allow us to display flash messages easily, as well as using the OAuth 2 gem to connect to the OneNote API. Once the gem file is saved, we'll use bundle to install the gems and make sure they're all on our system before we continue. You can see our gem files there, as well as our lock file, as well as our views directory, which we created earlier. We're going to create a new OneNote demo file. This will be our single file application. We're going to require all our gems, so that's the Sinatra reloader, which allows us to reload the application on the fly without stopping and starting our web server, as well as our flash gem, OAuth 2 gem, and as well as a time gem for some added functionality. We're going to enable sessions straight away. That allows us to store data in our session variables, and we're going to start our web server on port 80. It's now listening on port 80 on the local host, and if I click OneNote demo site, you can see that Sinatra is listening to the page already, and it does not know how to render a call to our root, as you can see in the error message. We're going to implement the get to our root, the backslash, and all that's going to do is render out our index page using ERB, embedded Ruby. All our views are stored in our views directory, and you can see over here that even though we've said that it must render our index, the index is not found yet. We still have to create it. So we're going to open our view, our index view, and into that we'll just quickly write a hello test page to make sure everything is running correctly, and when we reload the page, you see everything's working fine. We've pasted in some boilerplate just to display our flash messages on whether there's a success or an error, as well as some jQuery and Bootstrap JavaScript to make everything look nice. We reload the page again, and you can see everything is loading and our web server is serving up the pages correctly. We only want to display the login button if we know that someone is logged in. So we put in a conditional in our page to check if someone's logged in. And again, this is an undefined method because it has been defined, and we're going to define that right now. This is a helper method, so it's available to the view. So we put it inside our helper block, and we define logged in. We're going to set it to false initially, and we'll reset it later on when we get the token from OAuth 2. As you can see over here, we've got our OneNote API, where we'll be posting our requests to, as well as the options the SDK needs, the site, as well as the authorization URL and the token URL. We've also included the scopes we need to get access to the API, the WL offline access to get a refresh token, to be able to re-authenticate, OneNote create to create pages. We're now going to create our OAuth client, and as you can see, we pass in our client ID and client secret that we defined in an earlier video in the series. We're going to read in the client ID and the client secret from a separate file called client details. I've put in some dummy details here, but I'll change them to the correct ones once this is off screen. This is just to give you an idea that the details will be written from this file into our main application. I've pasted in some other data we need. We've got an OAuth redirect URI, which is where the Microsoft API is going to redirect to, as well as the live login URL, which we construct via this call using our redirect URI as well as the scopes. In our index now, we're going to paste in a button to log in, which is only displayed if the person is not logged in, so it's in the else block. And here you can see it displayed. If we click on it, we're going to enter in our user credentials, and you can see that we are redirected to our site along with a code that we will use to get our token. So we now have to implement the redirect request, which we do in this block. We get our token request using the OAuth client. We pass in the code parameter that we highlighted in the earlier screen, as well as the redirect URI. We take the token and we put it into our session so that it's stored for later use, and we put in some basic error checking in case there's an exception. If there is an error, we'll put the error flash and display the error message. And once we have got our token and with no error, we redirect back to our root page. Although now we have an error because of we can't reuse the code, so we will log in again and be redirected correctly. Of course, our logged in variable has still defaults to false, so now we're going to set that if the token is present in our session, we know we're logged in. If we logged in correctly, we'll display a successfully logged in message. And here you can see that happens. We've posted in a form that we use to post the note to the OneNote API. And if you refresh the page now, you will see the form displayed. We're just going to make the form slightly smaller so it fits nicely onto one page. We just put in some test data, which will post to the create note action using the post method, passing in a title as well as a body. If we do that now, we'll get another error because we haven't implemented the create note post action. And we'll do that quickly. This action will then post the render a HTML document and post that through to the OneNote API. So we just put in some error checking box quick, and we'll fill those in later. And we'll just put an ensure block in the redirect and do that. So using the form that was posted, we're going to render the note, again using an embedded Ruby view called note. And we're going to pass into this view a few local variables, mainly the title and the body, which we'll get from the title and body parameters that we were posted. And then using the OAuth 2 gem, we'll create an access token using our client as well as our token that's stored in session. We'll use this access token to then post to the OneNote API. And the body of that post will be our rendered note, as well as a header saying that the content type of this note is HTML. We'll rescue the error, and if it happens, we'll display the error message on the page in the flash. If there is no error, then we'll display a success message in the notice. And we'll ensure that we redirect back to the root whether there was an error or not. We'll go to OneNote and log in there so we can watch as the note gets created. So now we're going to create our note that is going to be posted to OneNote. So we create our note view. We post in some boilerplate over here. You can see there's the title and the body of the local variables that we posted in. So now we can set our title and our body. You can see here is a previously existing note that was previously created. We'll post it through to our app, which will then post it to the OneNote API, and it was done successfully. And if we reload, you can see our note has been created. Thanks a lot. I hope you learned a lot.
Hi, this is Hilton Giesenow, and in this video we're going to learn about how to build a universal app that speaks to the OneNote API. So to save us a little bit of time, I've created the universal app already in Visual Studio using the universal app template here in Visual Studio 2013. And what I've also done is to go into the Windows project and the Windows Phone project and go ahead and add the appropriate NuGet references. So you can see I've added references here to the Live SDK, which we'll be using to do things like authenticate against the OneNote API. And also I've brought in the Microsoft HTTP client libraries so that we can make the call to the API itself. I've brought in JSON.NET. We're not actually going to use it too much in this video, but of course you can use it for the parsing of the JSON data that comes back. So I've included it here as well. I've done exactly the same in the Windows Phone project, so I've gone in and brought the same NuGet packages in. Now we're going to be going and sharing some code, of course, in the shared project here, but we're actually going to go as far as sharing the same user interface or UI between the Windows Phone and Windows 8 projects. This is sometimes a little bit absurd to do because the dimensions and so on of the screens are quite different between the devices. But in this case, we want to actually see that we can share even all the way to the full UI level to share the code to go ahead and call the OneNote API. So I'm going to go ahead and add a new item to the project, and I'm going to add a XAML blank page. We're working with OneNote, of course, so I'm going to call it something that represents that, and I'll call it the OneNote page XAML file. Once that's done, once again, just to save us a bit of time, I'm going to copy paste some code in here. And what we're going to do is change the background color a little bit and then introduce a stack panel and a scroll viewer and a stack panel inside of that to host the controls that we're going to work with. We're going to start off with a sign in button and a create page button. And these are going to be enabled set to false initially. So only when we're ready are we even going to enable the sign in button, let alone the create page button. I'm going to rewire up the event handlers here, and then finally we have a text block on the bottom where we'll write out the results of what we're doing and any result that comes back. So let's switch now into the code behind for the XAML page. We're going to declare a few private fields up top here, and we're going to store the first of these as the scopes that we're going to use to call against the API. And next we'll have an endpoint, which is the actual address for the OneNote API. Now, once we start calling the API, we need to pass it in the permissions that we want to physically request from the live services and from the OneNote API in particular, and that's what these scopes are. So we've got three at play here. The first is a sign-in capability, which of course allows the user to sign into the services via our application. The next is the offline access scope, which allows us to request refresh tokens so that we can re-authenticate the user over time. And finally, we have the OneNote create capability, which allows us, of course, to create a page in the OneNote API, which is what we want to do in this video. Finally, we also have a live auth client and a live connect client instance that we're going to make use of. And these come out of the live SDK, of course, and they allow us to authenticate against the live services and get hold of those authentication details so that we can authenticate our call later. The next step is to override the onNavigated_to method, where we'll go ahead and wire up some of the live authentication capabilities. So we're not going to do the sign-in yet, but we are going to go ahead and ensure that we can connect to the live services as we want to do. So we fire up a live login result instance variable there, and we're going to call a particular method on the live auth client. We're going to do this asynchronously, so we're going to use the await keyword, and once we do that, of course, we need to decorate our current method with the async keyword as well. Then we'll call the initialize async operation on the live auth client. We'll pass in the scopes just so that it can prepare itself to actually do things like handle the sign-in. Once that's come back, then we can go ahead and enable the sign-in button. So once some of that background work has been done, the user will finally be able to go ahead and sign in. So let's jump into the sign-in button click event. Now we could of course wrap this in a try catch block and handle any exceptions or so that come back. So I'm going to put that in place, but I'll leave that up to you to deal with any of the exceptions that you may want to process and so on. What we're going to do here though is to go ahead and also get access to a live login result, so that will make sure that the login has worked successfully. And we'll have a similar pattern to what we had above, but this time instead of initializing, we're going to go ahead and actually perform a login using the login async operation. We'll pass in the scopes, of course, again, to make sure that we're logging in with a correct security profile. And once we've done that, we will verify that we're actually connected correctly using the login result status property. If we are, then we can go ahead and create a live connect client instance using the session that comes back. And this is where we're going to go ahead and get the authorization token that we need later. Now that we've done the actual sign-in though, we can go ahead and enable the create page button. So let's switch over to that code, and in here we'll go ahead and set some text onto the info text block so that the user can see that the request is actually being sent. And next we'll start looking at the payload that we're going to send to create the actual page in the OneNote API. So the OneNote pages are actually a subset of HTML. So I'm going to paste in some static HTML here that we can go ahead and examine. If you're familiar with HTML, you'll recognize things like the HTML opening and closing tag and so on. We also have a head section and a body section. The body contains the primary content of the page that we want to appear in OneNote, but the head controls things like the title of the actual OneNote page, as well as the created timestamp. It's important to know on this created timestamp that the date needs to be in a very specific format. So we're going to use the datetime toString operation and go ahead and format it as an ISO 8601 format. And this handles the UTC time zone capability as well as any local time zone offsets appropriately. We do this inside of a meta tag in the HTML, so we'll go ahead and stamp that created flag. And then finally, we also have the body content here, which we can have a look at as well. So some paragraphs, a bit of text formatting with italics, for example. We can go ahead and paste links in there, as well as even embed an image. And when we embed the image using a direct path like this, the OneNote client will go ahead and actually download and embed that image into the document. So that's the payload. Let's have a look at actually going and calling the API now that we've authenticated appropriately and we have the payload. So we're going to create an HTTP request message instance here. So we'll call it create page message, and we'll go ahead and new it up. It is going to be a post message, so we'll go ahead and set it as such, and we'll go ahead and specify the API endpoint that we want to call that we defined above. Next, the actual message content here we'll define as string content, so we'll pass in the sample HTML payload we created. We need to be sure to go ahead and set that it is UTF-8 encoded text, and finally we'll tell it that the media type is text HTML that we're sending in. Now that we have a message ready, we can go ahead and create a new HTTP client instance. So I'll just go ahead and new one of those up. And once that's done, we can set the appropriate headers. So first we're going to go ahead and specify that we're expecting a JSON payload to come back from the service. So we'll go ahead and set the accept header, and we'll add in the appropriate JSON settings. And once we've done that, we can go ahead and set the authorization header. Now, because we're using OAuth tokens to go ahead and authenticate against the OneNote API, we need to set a bearer header and go ahead and set that the bearer token comes off of the Live Connect client, off of the session property, and finally we'll access that access token. We're now ready to make the call, so let's go ahead and create an HTTP response message, and we'll go ahead and do that asynchronously as well. So let's appropriately set the correct keywords there, and then off of the HTTP client we can go ahead and call the send async operation and get that response back. And then let's go ahead and process that response in a separate method, just so that we can keep our code a little bit tidier. So let's go ahead and implement the process response method. Inside of here we can go ahead and verify the status code. Now, if the page is created successfully, then we should appropriately get an HTTP status code of 201, which is a created response. If we do so, then we can access the payload and write something appropriate out to the user and so on. But of course, if that 201 doesn't come back, then it means something went wrong, and we'll handle that a little bit later. So off of that response message type, we can go ahead and get the content and read it asynchronously. Once again, we'll use the async and await keywords, and then we can go ahead and simply provide an appropriate response out to the user here. Now in this case, because we're developers and we're creating a developer sample here, we're just going to write the raw string payload as it comes back from the service. Inside of here, as we'll see hopefully later in the video if everything works, we will have a JSON encoded string with multiple URLs to go ahead and access the newly created notebook. But we'll see that later. Once again, we're just going to write it out in raw form here so that we can see if everything's working. Next, we'll handle that else block and make sure that that we're doing something if things don't work as expected. The final stage here is to go ahead and set that our app must use, instead of the main page that it would otherwise have used, our new OneNote page. And with that, we're going to go ahead and run the application. The Windows Store app is the default type here, so we can go ahead and run that app and see if everything works successfully. Now, we should in fact get a failure, and we get an exception occurring. It's a little bit of an obscure exception, an object reference not set, which, as we know in the programming world, is sometimes not the most specific error in terms of guiding us to the resolution. In this case, what it means though is that although our code is actually fully written and doing everything we want to do, in order to get the appropriate tokens that we need from the authentication capability, so in order to get the OAuth tokens, essentially, we need to have a client ID registered behind the scenes. So we need to go ahead and register an application into the store. So we can do that on the Windows project by right-clicking on the project, going to the Store submenu, and then going ahead and choosing the Associate App with the Store menu option. When we do that, we get a new wizard that loads up, which allows us to go ahead and create a new application in the store and get all of the details that we need. I'm going to step through the login process here, so I'll step away for a moment. And once that's done, we can proceed through to the next steps here. Now, the wizard here will access the store and get hold of all of the applications that we may have registered already. I'm going to create a new one for this video so that we can see everything that's involved. So I'm going to actually choose an app name that's a little bit nonsensical. It's got periods and so on inside of it, but it's because I want to make sure that it's something that's unique. And it seems like the name is okay, it is unique, and I can go ahead and reserve it and use it inside of this application. So we're going to get the store association file here, and we can now run the Windows Store application. But let's do the same for the Windows Phone app as well. Once again, I'll step through the wizard, I'll step past the login screen, which you might need to do again, and we can go ahead and use the same app credentials inside of our Windows Phone app here. With that done, we now have the ability to get the access tokens that we need and sign into the server. So if we run the application again, this time the Windows app again, we can go ahead and get that sign in button enabled. So the initialization is complete and the sign in process is now possible for the user. When they go ahead and hit that sign in button, then they will need to go ahead and authenticate the application. So we need to go ahead and accept the appropriate permissions that we've provided in our scopes. So you'll see here the ability to sign in automatically, to get a refresh token, which is referred to here as access your info anytime, and then of course to create new pages in OneNote. Now the details of this particular accept screen, the privacy and cookies and terms and conditions and so on, you can go ahead and set inside the Windows Store app registry, where you can go ahead and set all of the details for your application, capture an icon and so on. But we'll accept the defaults here for now as a user and go ahead and accept that the app can access the info, and we get taken back to the app. The sign-in is complete and we can now go ahead and create a page. So we see it sending the request and we see the payload coming back successfully. Take note that there are two URLs that come back from the create request. The one is a OneNote client URL. So this is a URL that's prepended with the OneNote protocol. So this means that if the user does have a OneNote client running on their machine, let's say the full desktop OneNote client, or on a phone, for example, the OneNote phone app that's embedded in a Windows device, for instance, then they can go ahead and launch that native application with a link straight to that particular note. However, OneNote is available over the web as well, so we can use the OneNote web URL and go ahead and access that URL directly in a browser to access the newly created page. In this case, on the full Windows desktop machine, I'm going to load the full desktop OneNote, go ahead and browse into the Quick Notes section, and we'll see the new note that we created appearing. Now, it is possible in the OneNote API to go ahead and create pages into specific sections and into specific notebooks as well. In this case, we're just going against the default OneNote API endpoint, and so the notes will get created into the user's default Quick Notes section in whatever notebook that happens to be configured for the user. Okay, let's run the Windows Phone app now. So we'll go ahead and set that as the startup app. We'll go ahead and run the application again. The Windows Phone emulator loads, and once it's fully loaded, it'll go ahead and deploy our application and load it up. Now this is a clean emulator, so there's no actual account registered on the particular device, for example, so we'll have to do a few things when we go ahead and sign in. But the initialization takes place quickly, and we can go to that sign-in process quickly. The Windows Phone device here is requesting that we go ahead and sign in the account though. So if the account was already registered on the device, it would take a little bit quicker, but in this case it isn't, so we're doing the primary Windows Phone account registration rather than just the registration for our app. I'm going to skip over the username and password screen here and go ahead and log in and have that ID associated with the device. Now, once again, we're doing the primary registration of this particular device's account. So we're going to skip things like the backup options and so on. And ultimately, we get taken back to the main app page. the main user's account is registered on the device, and we can now sign in this particular application. Again, these are steps that you won't need to do if you have multiple things running on the emulator or you're deploying to a real Windows Phone device where you would have the account configured already. So now we can do the sign-in. Once again, we get presented with the particular scopes that we requested, so the ability to sign in, get refresh tokens, and of course create pages in OneNote. So I'll go ahead and accept those permissions by clicking the next button on the device. And at this point, we should be signed in to the user's account, and we can go ahead and hit the Create Page button as soon as it becomes enabled. We can see the request being sent again, and of course the response coming back successfully as we hoped it would. Again, two URLs there, so there's a client URL and a web URL. Now the client URL won't work on the Windows Phone emulator device, because in some versions of the emulator, the OneNote client in particular has some bugs, so that may not work directly on your emulator, but it should work on the actual Windows Phone device. What we will do here though is go ahead and log into the browser and go ahead and hopefully see that page appearing inside of the appropriate quick notes section for a different user that I'm signed into. And once we give it a short moment, then we get our new page created inside of the OneNote client. So that's all in this video. We've seen how to go ahead and create a new page in the OneNote API inside of a universal app. We've seen how to go ahead and associate that app with the store appropriately to get a client ID, for instance. And we've also seen how to make use of scopes to go ahead and get the appropriate permissions for our application. And finally, how to send off the payload to create the new page. This has been Hilton Giesnow. Thanks for watching.